Hoop Metrics.
Welcome to our deep dive into one of basketball's most intriguing phenomena, home court advantage in the NBA. What gives home teams that extra edge? Is it the roar of the crowd, the comfort of familiar surroundings, or the help of friendly referees? In this video, we'll look at historical data to answer these questions. We'll crunch the numbers on home court winning percentage and home court free throw advantage to understand the major trends throughout NBA history. In the end, we'll develop a simple model that explains and reproduces the changes in home court winning percentage over the history of the NBA. The home team has won 61.5% of all games in the NBA and ABA. This is a big effect. This means that a mediocre 500 level team, if they were able to play all games at home, would have the record of a solid playoff team. This is a plot of the historical home court winning percentage. The home court advantage peaked at a massive 73% in the 1951 season, but we'll focus mostly on the era from 1960 to the present. Here's a brief overview. We'll split this up into 4 general time periods. In the 1960s and early 70s, the home court advantage was relatively weak. Next, there was a transition period in the late 70s and early 80s, directly after the NBA-ABA merger. This short period is characterized by a sharp dip in home court advantage. Then, in the late 80s and early 90s, the home court advantage was consistently very high, almost a 70% winning percentage for the home team. And finally, in recent years, there has been a consistent decline in home court advantage up to the present day. We'll show that the trends in all these periods can be understood and modeled by considering 3 effects. Number 1, travel strain. How big of a disadvantage is it to travel to road games? Number 2, officiating. How much do refs favor the home team? And number 3, the home crowd. How much of a psychological boost does the home crowd confer on the home team? First, let's look into travel strain. It's much easier to play at home, where you wake up in your own bed, follow familiar routines, and play in a familiar environment. In contrast, the road team has to travel long distances, sleep in unfamiliar hotel rooms, and deal with disrupted daily routines. These days, teams travel in chartered jets, stay in fancy hotels, and personal chefs cater their meals. But in an earlier era, travel was an ordeal. Here's a quote from Jerry West. "Travel was just a constant hassle, to be honest with you. You got used to it, the lack of sleep, catching the first available flight out, any mechanical issues. There was one incident in Chicago, and we didn't get to Philadelphia until 5 a.m. because of travel. That was a particularly bad game. Trying to sleep, that was always the big issue with me. Some people can get on an airplane and sleep. I couldn't sleep on planes. I couldn't sleep after games. There were tons of games you'd play with 4 or 5 hours sleep." The travel strain effect is real, but we would expect its impact to be stronger decades ago and diminish as teams started using private jets and travel became more comfortable and reliable. We would expect the transition to occur sometime after 1987, which is when the owner of the Detroit Pistons, William Davidson, purchased the first private jet used to fly players to road games. And in fact, you can see the home court winning percentage decline consistently after this point. But improving travel conditions can't be the only explanation for the home court advantage. For example, what's the reason for the peak in home court winning percentage in the late 80s? To understand this, let's take a look at officiating. The nice thing about officiating is that we have solid data. This is a plot of the differential in free throws attempted per game between the home team and the road team. For example, at the peak in the late 80s, the home team on average took over 8% more free throws per game than the road team. This directly translates into somewhere between 2 and 3 points per game. And the effect is stronger than just the free throw advantage. If the refs are consistently favoring the home team would win more non-shooting fouls, which also affect the game but don't translate directly into free throws. The general trends in free throw differential track the trends in home court advantage. It seems that at certain points in NBA history, officiating has played a major role in fostering home court advantage. The 1960s were very unusual historically. In this period, the home team enjoyed virtually no advantage in free throw differential. In fact, in some seasons, the road team was even slightly favored. As you would expect, this time period corresponds to a relatively low home court winning percentage. The referees must have been incredibly disciplined, conscientious, or just plain stubborn in order to avoid the influence from the home crowd. We'll call the 1960s the golden age of the referee. One referee from this time period, Norm Drucker, exemplifies this golden age. He said, "I think there is a part of me deep down that enjoys calling a foul against the home team, and then standing out there alone, almost defying the cries of the hometown mob." Drucker officiated in the NBA in the 1960s, but was lured away to the ABA in the early 70s. Immediately after the NBA-ABA merger, he returned to the NBA and served as the NBA's supervisor of officials during this transition period, from 1977 to 1981. During this period, the free throw differential started at 7.6% in 1977, nearly an all-time high, and decreased to virtually zero in 1982. This corresponds to a big swing in home court winning percentage from 70% down to below 60%. Norm Drucker appears to have single-handedly reformed the NBA's officiating culture. We'll call this period the Drucker dip. This era of fair referees is completely gone by the 1980s, when the referees blatantly favor the home team. This corresponds to a persistent peak in home court advantage with several years above 65%. Did this shift in officiating reflect an unintentional drift in referee culture after the retirement of Norm Drucker? Did it reflect some change in officiating policy in the NBA? These are interesting questions with no immediate answers. We'll call this time period the home court heyday. Finally, we'll look at the modern era from the late 2000s to present day, during which there has been a consistent decline in referee advantage, along with a decline in home court advantage. To interpret this, we'll recall a controversial episode in NBA history, the 2006 NBA Finals between the Dallas Mavericks and the Miami Heat. In this series, the Mavs started off with 2 home wins. Following this, the Miami Heat swept the next 4 games, 3 of them at home, thanks in part to an incredibly high free throw rate by Dwayne Wade.
Game 4. Those shooting nights, but still score a lot of points because they get to the free throw line so often. Wade bumped.
During this series, Miami took 14 more free throws per game than Dallas when playing in Miami. When playing in Dallas, they only took 3 more free throws per game, a swing of 11 free throws per game. Following this series, Mavericks owner Mark Cuban went on a personal crusade advocating for reforms in NBA officiating. This is somewhat speculative, but we think it likely that this event initiated a period of consistently improving NBA officiating. This is consistent with the data. From 2007 onward, we see a steadily decreasing free throw advantage, along with a decreasing home winning percentage. We'll call this time period the Mark Cuban reform era. We've talked about the effect of travel strain and the officiating advantage, but what about the psychological advantage conferred upon the home players by the home crowd? How much of an advantage does a team get from 20,000 rabid fans cheering them on? The pandemic seasons provide some insight into this effect. The end of the 2019-2020 season was played in the bubble, where all players were quarantined at the same location to avoid COVID infections. Clearly, there was no such thing as a home court advantage during this period. In the 2021 season, home attendance was severely limited due to COVID restrictions. In the 21-22 season, mask mandates were still widespread. For large portions of these 3 seasons, the home crowd was either non-existent or very subdued. Is it a coincidence that these 3 seasons have the lowest home court winning percentage in the history of the NBA? Now let's see if we can distill what we've learned into a useful model. We're going to put numbers to the 3 home court effects to see if we can reproduce the major trends in home court advantage. We played around with these numbers until we found a good model that fits the data. This gives a good sense of the relative impact of these effects. Let's start with the effect of the home crowd and estimate that this confers a universal 5% advantage for the home team, with the only exception being the 3 pandemic seasons where we'll drop it to 2%. Next, let's add the effect of travel strain. We'll start with a 5% advantage in the early era of the NBA. This decreases after 1987 with the advent of private jets in the NBA. We'll assume this levels out to a 1% advantage over the last decade. Finally, let's add in the effect of officiating. Here, we assume that the free throw differential translates almost directly into a percentage advantage for the home team. This peaks at about 8% during the home court heyday and decreases in recent years to approximately a 2% advantage. If we put these all together on the same plot, we can visualize their relative impact. This suggests they have each had a major impact on home court advantage at various periods in NBA history. When we add these effects together, we get an effective model for home court winning percentage. In this figure, the red curve is our model, and the black curve is the actual winning percentage. As you can see, it reproduces quite accurately the major trends in home court advantage over the history of the NBA. The golden age of the NBA referee, the Drucker dip, the home court heyday, and finally, the Mark Cuban reform era. So what have we learned? 3 main effects have had a big impact on home court advantage over the history of the NBA, although their relative impact has shifted over time. We can recover the main trends throughout NBA history by combining these effects. Individuals can make a difference. It appears that both Norm Drucker and Mark Cuban have made an impact on officiating, and have made the NBA much more fair for the road team. We're now in an era with relatively fair officiating and much friendlier travel conditions. This leaves the home crowd as the major remaining effect on home court advantage. Based on this analysis, we predict that this universal effect of the home court advantage will persist, and home court winning percentages will level out at about 55% in the foreseeable future.
Hoop Metrics.